There is a reason some people feel a flash of irritation toward you for no clear reason at all. Not because you did something wrong. Not because you were rude or unkind or difficult. Sometimes people feel a quiet, uncomfortable dislike toward you simply because of who you are, how you carry yourself, or what you represent to them without either of you saying a single word about it. This isn't paranoia. It's something the psychologist Carl Jung spent his whole life trying to explain. And once you understand it, you will never look at other people's reactions to you the same way again. Most of us assume that if someone dislikes us, we must have done something to deserve it. We search our memory for the mistake, the wrong tone, the thing we said that came out sideways. But Jung believed something much stranger and, honestly, much more freeing. He believed that a huge amount of the dislike we receive from other people has almost nothing to do with us at all. It has to do with what we accidentally remind them of, buried deep inside themselves, in a part of their own mind they have spent their whole life trying not to look at. Before we go any further, if this is already making you think of someone specific, hit like on this video and subscribe to the channel right now. This one is going to get uncomfortable in the best way, and I don't want you to miss what comes next. Jung had a concept he called the shadow. The shadow is not evil, even though the name makes it sound that way. The shadow is simply everything about yourself that you have pushed out of your own awareness because at some point it wasn't safe or acceptable to show it. Maybe you were told as a child that anger was bad, so you buried your anger so deep you don't even recognize it in yourself anymore. Maybe you were praised only when you were agreeable, so your ability to say no, to want things loudly, to take up space, got shoved into the dark and locked away. Every single person alive has a shadow, because every single person alive grew up in a world that only approved of certain parts of them and quietly punished the rest. The parts that got punished didn't disappear. They just went underground. And here is the part that explains so much of the tension you feel with certain people. Whatever lives in someone's shadow, whatever they had to bury and deny about themselves to be accepted, it does not stay quiet. It looks for a way out, and one of the main ways it escapes is by projecting itself onto other people, usually people who are living out loud the exact thing the other person had to suppress. Think about that for a second, because this is where it gets personal. If you are someone who speaks your mind, you will attract quiet resentment from people who were taught that speaking your mind is dangerous. Not because you're doing anything wrong, because you are living, freely and visibly, the exact thing they had to kill in themselves to survive their own childhood, their own marriage, their own workplace. If you are someone who is comfortable being alone, who doesn't panic without constant company, you will unsettle people who never learned how to sit with themselves, because your comfort exposes their discomfort just by existing next to it. If you are someone who sets boundaries without guilt, you will irritate people who were never allowed to set a single boundary in their life without being punished for it. You haven't attacked them. You haven't even mentioned them. You have simply reminded them, just by being yourself, of the part of themselves they were forced to abandon. And nothing creates resentment faster than being reminded of a loss you were never allowed to grieve. This is why the dislike can feel so disproportionate, so oddly intense for something so small. You made one comment in a meeting, and suddenly a coworker's whole energy toward you shifts. You posted one photo where you looked happy and confident, and someone who used to be warm toward you goes cold. You didn't do anything cruel. You didn't insult anyone. You just existed visibly as yourself, and it triggered something in them that has nothing to do with you and everything to do with the parts of themselves they have spent years keeping in the basement. Jung would say what they are reacting to isn't you at all. It's their own shadow, wearing your face, because it's easier to hate you than to face the truth that they abandoned a part of themselves a long time ago and never forgave themselves for it. I want you to sit with something uncomfortable for a moment. This dynamic doesn't just happen to other people around you. It happens through you too. Think about someone who irritates you in a way that feels bigger than the situation calls for. Someone who is loud when you were taught to be quiet. Someone who spends money freely when you were taught to fear scarcity. Someone who leaves a relationship without guilt when you were taught to stay no matter what. That flash of irritation you feel toward them, faster than thought, is very often your own shadow reacting to someone living out the thing you buried in yourself. This isn't meant to make you feel guilty. It's meant to hand you a mirror, because once you can see this pattern operating in your own reactions, you can finally understand why it might be operating in other people's reactions to you. We're all doing this to each other, all the time, mostly without knowing it, and once you can name it, the entire game changes. Here's something else Jung understood that most people never get taught. The parts of yourself you like the least in other people are often disowned parts of your own personality, projected outward so you don't have to own them. But there's a flip side to this that almost nobody talks about, and it explains a different, quieter kind of dislike people carry toward you. Sometimes people don't hate what you buried. They hate what you've achieved, that they haven't allowed themselves to go after. Jung called this the golden shadow, the parts of ourselves that are not dark or shameful but bright, powerful and disowned anyway, because somewhere along the way we were taught that shining too brightly was dangerous, arrogant, or simply not allowed for someone like us. If you have ever felt a strange coldness from someone right after you shared good news, this is very often what is happening. Your success isn't threatening because they think less of themselves for no reason. It's threatening because it reminds them of a version of their own life they gave up on, a dream they buried so deep they convinced themselves they never wanted it in the first place. Your joy becomes uncomfortable evidence that the thing they told themselves was impossible was actually possible the whole time. And it is far easier for a wounded ego to resent the person who reminds them of that than to sit with the grief of a life not fully lived. This is why you have probably noticed that the people who struggle most to celebrate you are often not strangers. They're the people closest to you, the ones who watched you grow, who knew you before you became whoever you are becoming now. A stranger has no story invested in keeping you small, but someone who has known you a long time sometimes has an unconscious stake in you staying exactly as they remember you, because your growth quietly asks a question they don't want to answer. If you could change, why didn't they? This is not a flaw in them that makes them a bad person. It's simply the shadow at work, doing what it always does, protecting the ego from having to look directly at its own unfulfilled potential. Understanding this will not make the coldness from someone you love stop hurting completely, but it will stop you from believing the lie that their coldness is proof that something is wrong with you. It isn't proof of that at all. It's proof of something happening entirely inside them, something you happen to be standing in front of at the wrong moment. Now let's talk about something that might sting a little, because I think you need to hear it. If you've spent your whole life trying to be likable, trying to smooth every edge, trying to make sure nobody ever has a reason to dislike you, I need you to understand something important. That project was never actually possible, and chasing it has probably cost you more of yourself than you realize. You cannot control what your existence triggers in someone else's shadow. You could become the kindest, most careful, most self-effacing version of yourself imaginable, and there would still be people who feel something uncomfortable around you, because their discomfort was never really about your behavior. It was about what your presence stirs up in them. This means the entire strategy of trying to be liked by everyone, the strategy so many of us were taught without ever questioning it, is built on a false premise. It assumes other people's reactions to you are a fair, accurate measurement of your worth or your conduct. Jung would tell you that a huge percentage of the time they are not. They are a measurement of how much unprocessed material is sitting in that other person's shadow, waiting for a convenient face to attach itself to. I want to be careful here, because I don't want you to use this idea as a shield to avoid ever looking at your own behavior honestly. Some dislike really is earned. If you are cruel, if you are careless with people's feelings, if you break promises and blame others for it, that is not projection, that is simply cause and effect, and no amount of Jungian theory should let you off the hook for it. Self-awareness has to cut both ways, or it isn't self-awareness at all. It's just a clever excuse. So the real skill here, the mature version of this idea, is learning to tell the difference. Ask yourself honestly, did I actually cause harm here, or am I simply being disliked for existing as I am? Those two things require completely different responses. One requires an apology and a change in behavior. The other requires you to release your grip on needing that person's approval at all. Because chasing it will never work. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because the target was never something you could hit in the first place. It helps to picture it almost like weather. Some coldness from other people is a storm you actually caused, and the right response is to go back and clean up whatever mess you left behind. But some coldness is simply a front moving through their life that happened to pass over you, and no amount of umbrellas or apologies on your end will stop weather that was never about you to begin with. Learning to check the forecast honestly, instead of assuming every storm is your fault, is most of what emotional maturity actually is. Let's go a little deeper into why this concept lands so hard for people who think a lot, who are self-aware, who spend real time reflecting on themselves. If you are someone who has done any real inner work, who has looked honestly at your own flaws instead of pretending you don't have any, you already carry less shadow than most people around you. This is not arrogance to say out loud. It's simply what happens when someone actually does the work most people avoid their entire lives. And here's the uncomfortable truth about that. People with a lot of unexamined shadow material are often, without realizing it, uncomfortable around people who have done real inner work, because your clarity acts like a mirror they didn't ask to look into. You're not trying to expose them. You're just standing there, being honest and reasonably at peace with yourself, and that peace becomes a quiet, involuntary contrast to whatever chaos they haven't dealt with in themselves yet. Some people will be drawn to that peace and want to learn from it. Others will resent it, because it makes their own unresolved mess harder to ignore when it's standing right next to your calm. This also explains something that confuses a lot of people about themselves. Why they sometimes get the coldest reactions right when they're doing the best. You'd expect the opposite, right? You'd expect that when your life is going well, when you're finally consistent, healthy, showing up as your best self, people would be happier for you, not more distant. But shadow dynamics don't work on logic like that. The better you're doing, the more visible your growth becomes. And visible growth in someone else is one of the most triggering things for a person whose own growth has stalled. It's not that they consciously think, I hate that this person is thriving. It's much quieter than that. It's a low hum of discomfort they can't quite name. And the easiest way for the mind to resolve an unnamed discomfort is to find a reason to dislike its source. So they'll suddenly think you've changed, and not in a good way. They'll say you've gotten different, distant, too much. What they usually mean, underneath the words they're actually using, is that you've grown in a direction they haven't followed. And it's easier to criticize the growth than to admit they've been standing still. I want you to think about a specific relationship in your life right now, where this pattern might be playing out. Someone whose warmth toward you seems to rise and fall in a way that doesn't quite match your behavior. Someone who seems most comfortable with you when you're struggling, and strangely distant when you're doing well. This is one of the clearest signatures of shadow projection in a relationship. A person who can only love you at your lowest is often, without meaning to be cruel. A person who needs you to stay small so their own unresolved feelings about themselves don't get stirred up. This doesn't necessarily make them a bad person. Most people carrying this pattern have no idea they're doing it, but it does mean you get to stop taking responsibility for managing their comfort by shrinking your own life to fit inside it. Their discomfort with your growth was never yours to fix. Here's where this becomes genuinely useful instead of just an interesting idea to nod along with. Once you understand that a large amount of the dislike aimed at you is shadow material that belongs to someone else, you stop asking the wrong question. The wrong question is, what's wrong with me that this person doesn't like me? The right question is, what is it about me that this person's own unresolved history is reacting to, and is that actually something I need to change? 9 times out of 10, when you sit with that second question honestly, the answer is no. The thing they're reacting to is often the exact thing you should be protecting in yourself, not editing away. Your honesty, your boundaries, your calm, your ambition, your refusal to shrink. These are not character flaws that need fixing to earn approval. They are frequently the very things triggering someone else's unprocessed shadow, and the solution was never to dim them. The solution is to keep being exactly who you are, and let their reaction be information about them, not instruction for you. There's a deeper layer to Jung's thinking that I think you need to hear, because it changes how you relate to the people who dislike you, not just how you understand them intellectually. Jung believed that everything we refuse to see in ourselves we are doomed to encounter in the outside world, usually through the people who annoy us the most, or just as often, through the people who seem to be quietly working against us for no clear reason. This means the people who secretly dislike you are, in a strange and almost poetic way, holding up a mirror you didn't ask for. Not a mirror that shows what's wrong with you, but a mirror that shows what's unresolved in them. And if you can learn to read that mirror correctly instead of assuming it's showing you your own flaws, you gain something incredibly rare: the ability to stay grounded in who you are even while standing in the middle of someone else's discomfort. Most people never learn this. Most people absorb other people's projections as if they were objective truth, and they spend their whole lives quietly editing themselves down to avoid triggering reactions that were never actually about them in the first place. I also want to talk about what this means for how you treat other people, because understanding your own shadow is only half of what Jung was really pointing toward. If a large amount of your own irritation towards certain people is projection, then some of your own dislikes deserve a second look too. The next time you feel a sharp, disproportionate reaction to someone who is too confident, too relaxed, too unbothered by things that stress you out, pause before deciding they're simply a bad or annoying person. Ask yourself what part of you might be reacting to something you buried a long time ago. This is not about excusing genuinely harmful people, and it's not about talking yourself out of legitimate discomfort with someone's actual behavior. It's about developing the honesty to notice when your dislike is really about them, and when it's quietly about an old, unresolved part of yourself showing up uninvited in someone else's body. Jung didn't believe the goal of life was to eliminate the shadow. And this matters because a lot of people hear all of this and think the answer is to become perfectly self-aware, perfectly integrated, so enlightened that nobody's projections can touch you anymore. That's not realistic, and honestly, it's not even the goal. The goal Jung described was integration, not elimination. You are never going to fully get rid of your shadow, and neither is anyone else. What you can do is stop being ruled by it without knowing it's there. You can learn to notice when your own reactions are shadow material instead of truth. You can learn to recognize when someone else's coldness toward you is their unprocessed material instead of an accurate verdict on your character. That awareness alone, just the ability to pause and ask which one this actually is, changes almost everything about how much power other people's opinions have over your life. Let's bring this back to something very real and very specific, because I don't want to leave you with just theory. Think about the people in your life whose approval you've been quietly chasing without even fully realizing it. The relative who never seems impressed, no matter what you accomplish. The old friend who goes quiet every time something good happens to you. The co-worker whose validation you find yourself craving even though you can't say exactly why. Some part of you has probably been operating under the belief that if you just did enough, achieved enough, softened enough, became easy enough to be around, their coldness would eventually turn into warmth. I want you to consider seriously that it might not because you are failing at something, but because their reaction was never actually about a threshold you could cross. It was about material inside them that has nothing to do with your effort, your worth, or your behavior. You cannot perform your way into somebody else's unfinished inner work. No version of you, however improved, was ever going to be the thing that resolved what they haven't resolved in themselves. This is where the real freedom in Jung's idea lies. Once you stop treating every cold reaction, every flash of unexplained dislike, every subtle distancing as proof that you need to change something about yourself, you get to stop shape-shifting your whole personality around the moods of people whose reactions were never really about you. You get to keep your honesty even when it makes someone uncomfortable. You get to keep growing even when it unsettles someone who hasn't grown in the same direction. You get to celebrate your own life out loud even when someone goes quiet, because their silence is telling you something about their unlived life, not about the value of yours. This doesn't mean you stop caring about people or stop examining your own behavior honestly. It means you finally get to separate the dislike that's asking you to grow from the dislike that's simply asking you to disappear. And you get to stop giving those two very different signals the same amount of power over how you live. There is something almost freeing about realizing that you were never actually in control of how every person perceives you, and never will be. You can be honest, kind, self-aware, and generous, and there will still be people whose own unresolved history turns your presence into something uncomfortable for them. That was never a reflection of a mistake you made. It was simply the price of being a real, specific, visible person instead of a blank shape. Everyone can project whatever they want onto without resistance. The people who love the real version of you, contradictions and edges and all, were never going to be everyone, and that was always the point. You were not put here to manage the shadows of every person you meet. You were here to become whole, fully yourself, integrated instead of hidden, and to let the right people recognize that wholeness for what it actually is, without needing to shrink it down to something smaller just so it stops making anyone uncomfortable. There's one more thing worth understanding, and it might be the most useful part of all, because it moves this from theory into something you can actually use the next time it happens. When you feel someone's energy shift toward you for no clear reason, your nervous system will want to do one of two things immediately. It will want to fix it, apologizing for things you didn't do, softening yourself, asking what's wrong over and over until they finally say something, or it will want to match it, going cold back, building a case against them in your head, deciding they were never really on your side to begin with. Both of these reactions come from the same place. Both of them assume their coldness as information you need to respond to urgently, right now, before you can feel okay again. But there's a third option Jung's work quietly points toward, and it's the hardest one to practice because it requires patience instead of action. You can simply let their reaction exist without needing to solve it immediately. You can notice it. Name it honestly to yourself. This might be projection. This might have nothing to do with me. And then continue living your life without demanding an explanation right away. Some relationships repair themselves over time once the other person works through whatever got triggered in them. Others don't, and that tells you something too, quietly, without you needing to force a confrontation to find out. Either way, you are no longer at the mercy of needing an immediate resolution just to feel steady in yourself. That steadiness, the ability to sit in someone else's unexplained coldness without collapsing into fixing or fighting, is one of the clearest signs that you've actually integrated this idea instead of just understanding it in your head. I also think it's worth saying plainly that this pattern shows up most sharply in the relationships that matter most to you, which is exactly why it hurts the way it does. It would be easy to shrug off a stranger's cold energy online. It is much harder to shrug off the same thing from a parent, a close friend, a partner, someone whose opinion of you has mattered since before you knew how to protect yourself from it. The closer someone is to you, the more history they have with the version of you that existed before you started changing, and the more likely their shadow has quietly attached itself to the space you occupy in their life. This is why growth so often costs people relationships they didn't expect to lose, not because they did anything wrong to those people, but because growth is loud even when it's quiet, and not everyone standing next to you signed up to be reminded of their own unfinished business just by watching you finish yours. Some of those relationships will stretch to hold the new version of you. Some will not. Both outcomes are survivable, and neither one is proof that you did something wrong by continuing to grow. I want to leave you with one more distinction, because I think it's the difference between using this idea to grow and using it to hide. Understanding shadow projection is not a license to dismiss every piece of criticism that ever comes your way as someone else's baggage. That would be its own kind of self-deception, just dressed up in psychological language instead of denial. The real practice here is staying honest in both directions at once. When someone reacts to you with unexplained coldness, you get to ask calmly, and without defensiveness, is there something real here I need to look at? Or is this landing on me because of something that has nothing to do with me? Sometimes the answer will be uncomfortable, and it will point back at your own behavior, and the mature move is to actually take that in without spiraling into shame about it. But more often than people expect, especially for those of you who already spend real time reflecting honestly on yourselves, the answer will point outward, toward material that was never yours to carry in the first place. Learning to tell those two apart quickly, honestly, without your ego getting in the way of the answer, is one of the most valuable skills you will ever build, because it is the thing standing between a life spent apologizing for existing and a life spent simply fully being who you actually are. If this changed the way you think about the people who've gone cold on you, or the people you've quietly resented without knowing why, do two things for me right now. Hit like, because it helps this channel reach more people who need to hear exactly this. And subscribe, because there's a lot more where this came from, and I'm not done yet. I'll see you in the next one.